Hello, everybody. I hope you can see and hear me all right. It's a pleasure to talk to you tonight about Abraham Lincoln. As Derek explained, I've just written a Lincoln biography, not a banner year to launch a new book, but as long as people like yourselves are interested, I'm delighted to talk about it. Summoned to Glory is the title. The Audacious Life of Abraham Lincoln is the subtitle. I'm going to talk to you tonight about Lincoln's audacity, a rather novel or surprising way to characterize Lincoln in the minds of some, because a great many people view Lincoln as a moderate. A great many political scientists classify him as a moderate. What I aim to do tonight is to try to demolish that moderate myth as much as I can. I'm going to quote a few statements by previous Lincoln biographers to show you how profoundly deep-seated this notion about Lincoln's moderation really is. In 1952, one Lincoln biographer had this to say about Lincoln. Physically, he was always a powerful man whose body, like his mind, moved slowly, as is likely to be the way with country people, unquote. How's that for a generalization, both about Lincoln and country people? In 1995, another Lincoln biographer, I'm not naming names because I aim to be charitable, but these are direct verbatim quotes. In 1995, another Lincoln biographer said that the foremost quality that Lincoln displayed was an essential passivity, a reluctance to take the initiative and make bold plans, unquote. To which I say, nonsense. There are reasons why this moderate myth has taken hold with regard to Lincoln. I'm going to give you one example now, and I'll suggest another toward the end of the talk. But one of the reasons why this impression became so powerful is that Lincoln himself contributed to it, deliberately created the stereotype. Let me quote you a statement he made in 1864 in a letter to an editor named Albert Hodges. It's a rather famous statement. I trust that some or many of you have heard it before. Quote, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me," unquote. That is an absolutely authentic Lincoln statement. He made it, and I submit it is absolutely, was and is absolutely deceptive, deliberately deceptive. I'll give you a quick explanation why. At the moment Lincoln made this statement in April 1864, he was working secretly behind the scenes to open up the possibility of black voting rights. Albert Hodges was one of a delegation of Kentucky conservatives who came to complain to Lincoln about the way he was elevating the anti-slavery issue in a war that was supposed to be just about preserving the Union. That's the context in which Lincoln made the statement, pretending to be just carried along passively by events, doing what events dictated, not his fault, not deliberate, to which I reply, nonsense. He was giving himself cover because he was busily working away behind the scenes to not only push the cause of emancipation, but to do some pioneering work in partnership with abolitionists and radical Republicans, all behind the scenes to explore the possibility of black voting rights. Now, when I call Lincoln audacious, I do not mean to imply that he was always audacious. Nobody can always be any one particular way. I'm talking about what I see as the supreme quality in Lincoln during his years of greatness. He had to develop his powers through a very tough life. As my biography explains, he was no stranger to heartbreak, to deep depression, to family tensions, to all manner of misfortunes. But through it all, he was able to build this innate power of boldness until it intersected a critical juncture of events, a crisis in American history during the 1850s. Now, Lincoln's known predominantly, and for understandable reasons, as the paramount unionist, saved the Union, and he is known widely, but not universally, as the great emancipator. Lincoln's detractors, and he's had detractors on both sides of the ideological range, but particularly left of center detractors have complained for some time that Lincoln doesn't deserve his reputation as the great emancipator, that he was prone to some racist biases that were prevalent at the time, that the real heroes of the anti-slavery crusade were the fighting abolitionists and the radical Republicans who pushed Lincoln into doing what he did. An angry African-American journalist named Lerone Bennett Jr. came out with a book about 20 years ago called Forced into Glory. My book, Summoned to Glory, views it differently. Lincoln rose to destiny in 1854 when he, like many anti-slavery Americans, became angered, enraged, radicalized by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of Stephen Douglas, which opened up the Louisiana Purchase territory to the spread of slavery in areas where slavery had been banned since the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That was how Lincoln began to make a name for himself, taking on Stephen Douglas, challenging him. By 1858, trying to throw him out of the U.S. Senate and take his place. Lincoln rose to fame by relentlessly hounding, attacking Stephen Douglas, but not just as a vendetta, not just as a personality-based feud, but because by 1858, when he kicked off his campaign to unseat Stephen Douglas in the soon-to-be famous House Divided speech, Lincoln warned that because of the Supreme Court decision of the previous year, 1857, the Dred Scott decision, slavery could spread, slavery would spread, slavery was spreading, not only into Western territories that would be carved up into states later, but could spread into the free states, could spread all over the United States until it became nationalized. Many people who haven't read the House Divided speech think of it, get the impression that it was a sorrowful, saintly plea to Americans on both sides to draw back from the brink, lest the tragedy of a divided house ruin America. Nonsense. It was the reverse. Lincoln was saying in this speech that America's divided house, divided over the issue of slavery, was uniting. It was uniting the wrong way. It was uniting in a way that would make slavery national. And the House Divided speech was a summons to Republicans to prevent the uniting of America's divided house. You'd prevent the House from uniting the wrong way in order that slavery could be contained and then forced back upon itself, forced into extinction so that America's divided house could unite the right way. I'm going to read a fairly lengthy speech excerpt from a speech of Lincoln's that's very little known. It was an extremely dramatic, melodramatic speech. It was given at night by torchlight. He was speaking from a balcony of the Tremont House Hotel in Chicago to a crowd of supporters down below. July 10th, 1858 was the date of the speech. He was attacking Douglas, but he was doing more. He was attacking slavery, and he was attacking the notions of white supremacy that justified slavery. I want to point out several things about this speech before I read the excerpt. This speech was not written out beforehand. The only way we have this speech is because journalists took it down as he gave it, using a brand new invention, shorthand. And in taking down the speech and transcribing it, they also transcribed crowd reactions, which is an extremely interesting and valuable thing to have. Lincoln refers to Senator Stephen Douglas throughout the speech as Judge Douglas. And I'm going to explain why shortly, but just bear that in mind lest you be confused. There's one other thing about the speech. I'm going to read it fast. There is no way to know, of course, how quickly or slowly Lincoln delivered this or any other speech. But if you read it over, if you scan the words and then read them aloud at a slow pace, well, when I do it, it tends to bog down. But when I read the text quickly, it seems to just snap into place and release a tremendous on-flowing force that was at the time clearly and is now, if we read this speech this way, quite charismatic. Listen. Now serves for the purpose of squaring things with this idea of don't care if slavery is voted up or down, for sustaining the Dred Scott decision. A voice, hit him again. For holding that the Declaration of Independence did not mean anything at all, we have Judge Douglas giving his exposition of what the Declaration of Independence means, and we have him saying that the people of America are equal to the people of England. According to his construction, you Germans are not connected with it. Now I ask you in all soberness, if all these things, if indulged in, if ratified, if confirmed and endorsed, if taught to our children and repeated to them, do not tend to rub out the sentiment of liberty in this country and transform this government to a government of some other form. Those arguments that are made that the inferior race are to be treated with as much allowance as they're capable of enjoying, that as much is to be done for them as their condition will allow. What are these arguments? They're the arguments that kings have made for enslaving the people in all ages of the world. You will find that all the arguments in favor of kingcraft were of this class. They always bestrode the necks of the people, not that they wanted to do it, but because the people were better off for being ridden. That's their argument. And this argument of the judge is the same old serpent that says, you work and I eat. You toil and I will enjoy the fruits of it. Turn in whatever way you will, whether it come from the mouth of a king, an excuse for enslaving the people of his country, or from the mouth of men of one race as a reason for enslaving the men of another race. It is all the same old serpent. And I hold that if that course of argumentation that is made for the purpose of convincing the public mind that we should not care about this should be granted, it does not stop with the Negro. I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares all men equal upon principle, and making exceptions to it, where will it stop? If one man says it does not mean a Negro, why not another say it does not mean some other man? If that declaration is not the truth, let us get the statute book in which we find it and tear it out. Who is so bold to do it? Voices, me, know it. If it is not true, let us tear it out. Cries, no, no. Now, those words are not chiseled on the walls of Lincoln Memorial. If it sounded, when he gave it, the way it sounded as I read it right now, this was an electrifying speech. Lincoln could be a spellbinder, and the spirit of boldness behind the audacity of his acts can be heard pulsing through this speech. Notice that Lincoln used the text of the Declaration of Independence, the equality text, and he applied it to the race issue. He talked about those who would degrade the so-called inferior race. Lincoln talked quite a lot about the race issue in 1858, this year when he was running against Stephen Douglas, the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He talked about it because Stephen Douglas was a ferocious white supremacist. And based upon many, many accounts, the state of Illinois in the 1850s was one of the most racist-free states, one of the most racist states in the country outside of the South. And Douglas, to defend himself, kept putting Lincoln on the defensive. asking him, do you or do you not support black equality? Do you or do you not support giving blacks equal rights? And before very long, Douglass would turn this racist abuse in a very sordid direction. Um, he would constantly bring up the subject of race mixing, interracial sex. And that was his argument. These Republicans are against the spread of slavery. They're against slavery because they want to free the slaves and then elevate them into the equals of all of you. Do you want one marrying one of your daughters? What about it, Mr. Lincoln? Do you support that? Now, it's in this context that Lincoln did say some things that don't sound very good by the standards of today's values. Things that some of his critics have cited to suggest that he harbored some racist notions himself. But I don't have as much time as I would like to get into this matter. I've written a whole book about it, Lincoln and Race. But the thing about these statements compared to that fiery oration I just quoted to you is that every one of these statements was dull, legalistic, almost lifeless. It began with a disclaimer. I have no purpose, Lincoln would say, to introduce equality, black voting rights, and so on and so forth. All right, it sounds pretty bad, but look at the way he framed the statement. He didn't say that in his heart of hearts he wouldn't like to see racial equality. He didn't say that his current position, the current situation, which he was describing factually, that he was not proposing to make blacks equal, would characterize his behavior ever afterward. He wasn't saying that. He chose his words in a very careful, lawyerly-like way to deflect the attacks of Douglass. And it's interesting to compare what Lincoln said in these exchanges with Douglass in 1858 to what he was doing in 1864 as president, when, as I told you a while ago, he was working secretly behind the scenes to create the basis for black voting rights. Absolutely secret. Had to be because of all the white supremacy sentiment, which is why he made that statement to Albert Hodges and the other visitors. I claim not to have controlled events. Oh, he was trying to control them all right, control them in secret. Lincoln could be very, very tricky as a strategist. He could be deceptive when he needed to be. Now, the subject of presidential lying is on our minds quite a lot these days, and for good reason. None of us appreciates being lied to, but there are circumstances in history and in everyday life when, for ethical reasons, it may be justified to deceive. To give you a great big obvious example, pretend, this may sound like special pleading, but let's go with it. Pretend it's World War II. You are a member of the generation that is fighting to stop the Axis from achieving military victory, to stop Hitler and the Nazis from achieving victory. It's total war. Now, in the war to stop Hitler, are you justified in playing tricks on him? Well, as any kid these days would tell you, the answer is, any kid today would say, well, duh, that's a no-brainer. Of course you are. You better hope the tricks are effective and work. I'm going to read you some descriptions of Lincoln the lawyer that fellow lawyers set down in memoirs within a few decades after Lincoln's death. Here is one account of the way Lincoln would achieve courtroom victories. A fellow attorney observed that Lincoln, quote, had the manner of treating his antagonist with such perfect fairness as to make the jury and bystanders think that he could not be induced to take advantage of it, a manner which was the hell-firedest lie that was ever acted, because the very fairness he assumed was an ambuscade to cover up a battery with which to destroy the opposing counsel, and so skillfully laid to that after it had done its work, only occasionally would the defeated party and almost never would the uninitiated discover the deception, unquote. Here's the way a close friend of Lincoln's, a fellow attorney named Leonard Swett, described Lincoln's courtroom strategy. Quote, as he entered trial where most lawyers object, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to let this in or that. And sometimes when his adversary could not quite prove what Lincoln knew to be the truth, he would say he reckoned it would be fair to admit the truth to be so-and-so. When he did object to the court after he heard his objections answered, he would often say, well, I reckon I must be wrong. But by giving away 6 points and carrying the 7th, he carried his case. Anyone who took Lincoln for a simple-minded man would very soon wake up on his back in a ditch, unquote. This is the Lincoln I came to know as I studied his words and deeds over the years, as I studied his life. He was a bold and daring leader who took tremendous risks to achieve tremendous things. And in the 1850s, as I've said, his paramount objective was to prevent slavery from spreading all over the Union. That was the platform of the Republican Party in 1860. That was the goal of the Free Soil movement that Lincoln had come to lead at that time. And it triggered civil war. It triggered secession as soon as Lincoln won. And here's why. Because if slavery couldn't spread, if no more slave states were going to be created in those vast open Western territories, new states would continue to be created out there and they would all be free states. So within a generation, the free states would outnumber the slave states, which would mean that slave state representatives in Congress would soon enough be unable to block anti-slavery legislation. Oh, they could complain that the legislation was unconstitutional. They could take that legislation to court. But as soon as the free state majority became a supermajority of 3/4, there would be enough free states to ratify a constitutional amendment overturning slavery. And that is, of course, exactly the way that slavery was ended in the United States through the 13th Amendment in 1865. The leaders of the slave states knew that. They foresaw it. And when Lincoln captured the presidency in 1860, as we would say, they came to the conclusion that the game was over. And every secession convention said that to the citizens of the state in question. They said, it is time to go because our central institution, slavery, has now been placed in a completely untenable position. And now we reach the point where Lincoln rises to his presidential destiny, where he assumes the burden of saving the Union and becomes, by the standards of some, the great emancipator in the process. But I'm going to suggest several things about Lincoln, the Unionist. There were different ways of saving the Union, quote unquote. There were different ways of trying to reconcile the sectional division over slavery. That division had been resolved temporarily through one compromise after another, beginning with the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and then the Compromise of 1850. What Lincoln insisted upon in 1860 is that there would be no more compromises. He would not back down from his vow to keep slavery contained, and he would not permit secession. He would save the Union, but he would save it his way. Save it his way. He would save it with slavery contained and hopefully over time to be put on path to gradual extinction. He would save the Union in a way that kept that Union devoted to the founding intention proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence, which after all was the theme of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So famous that the words go stale on us. But Lincoln told that crowd in 1863 that this terrible war was a test to determine not only whether this nation, but whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure. Dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. What Lincoln was out to do in the Civil War was not just to save a nation, the United States, and the Union that made it a nation. Lincoln was out to kill another emergent nation, the Confederate States. And this was the second part of his great struggle against slavery. The first part was to keep it from spreading all over the United States. And then when his victory in 1860 unleashed secession, his second great goal was to prevent the emergence of a new, powerful pro-slavery nation. That's a different way to see Lincoln's unionism. Now, as soon as the secession crisis broke out, there were attempts in Congress to save the Union through yet another compromise. In December 1860, the so-called Crittenden Compromise was introduced. It consisted of a package of constitutional amendments, one of which would have violated Lincoln's 1860 platform. It would have permitted slavery to keep spreading. In secret letters, Lincoln told Republicans in Congress, in effect, kill this, kill this. Do not let this happen. Stop it. Hold on, he told one fellow Republican, as with a chain of steel. Now remember that. I'm going to bring it up again in just a few minutes. When the war began, Lincoln had to do several things, most fundamentally to achieve military victory. And here Lincoln's audacity, Lincoln's boldness, reaches another level, one that a number of military historians recognized years ago. Lincoln proposed to win the Civil War by fighting total war. Total war. Years ago when I was teaching a graduate course on the Civil War, a student of mine was a student at the Naval Academy. And as he listened to me, he said, you know, Lincoln was practicing the doctrines of Clausewitz before Clausewitz was even translated into English, let alone taught at the military academies. He was practicing doctrines of total war. And part of this total war strategy ran counter to everything that most of the generals, North or South, had been taught at the military academies. They had been taught to play war as though it were a chess game. The goal was to attack the enemy's capital, to put the enemy in effect into checkmate. The armies of the enemy were obstacles to be maneuvered around in order to achieve that kind of victory. Lincoln saw the armies of the enemy not as obstacles, but as targets. And he had to overrule one military commander after another. It took him years, from 1861 until 1864, before he had a high command in place of generals who were absolutely committed to putting Confederate armies out of action, either by forcing them to surrender or by wiping them off the face of the earth. Now that is audacity, and it's not a very nice theme to contemplate, but total war, as William Tecumseh Sherman, one of those generals, would famously proclaim, is hell. The audacious Lincoln. But at the same time that Lincoln was trying to find a high command capable of carrying out a war like that, he was playing a very, very different game on the domestic scene. Here's where he came off as a moderate. Yes, a moderate, but he had to. It was a tactic, not a strategy, but a tactic meant to maintain a bipartisan war coalition. He had to maintain it because if partisan differences became too rancorous, if the Democrats got control of Congress, they might cut off the funding for the war. The Democratic Party then, unlike now, was overwhelmingly a white supremacist party. And the Democrats were constantly, the Democrats were divided into pro-war unionist Democrats and the so-called Copperheads, the peace Democrats who wanted to cut a deal with the South. But they were all united in the belief that the war would not have happened if the Negro-loving Republicans had not pushed the slave states over the brink. Lincoln had to manage that issue and maintain enough public support, enough support in public opinion to keep enough of a political consensus to keep that war going. So he came off as a moderate, yes, but he was doing something else. Secretly, behind the scenes, he was trying to expand his anti-slavery agenda to reach beyond the preliminary goal of containing slavery, stopping its spread, to set in motion a sequence of events that would put it on course for long-term phase-out. In March 1862, Lincoln sent to Congress an unprecedented piece of legislation, a piece of legislation that would offer money to slave owners, not only in the loyal slave states, the slave states that had not fallen under the control of secessionists, but to slaveholders in the rebel states. It was a buyout plan, hundreds of millions of dollars. The federal government would offer this money to any slave owners who would set their slaves free, and Lincoln justified it as a war measure. He had to, because no president had ever been in a position. Well, many of his predecessors as president had been white supremacists, and they had no inclination to send such legislation to Congress. But even the anti-slavery presidents knew that any legislation like that would be just dead on arrival in Congress, so it was never done. Lincoln was the first president to actually try such a thing, and he got it passed on a near straight party line vote. Democrats would not vote to support taxes to buy Negroes. Well, Lincoln justified it as a war measure. He said, we all know that it's the controversy over slavery that started this war. If you tote up the cost of buying out all the slave owners, setting their slaves free, and compare that to the financial cost of this ruinous war, any fool can see that it's a very good deal, just putting it in terms of strict calculation. And after Congress passed this act, for the next 3 months, Lincoln invited delegations of politicians, political leaders from the loyal slave states, the slave states that had not fallen under the control of secessionists, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. And he pleaded with them to kick off the plan, give it a try, show slaveholders in the rebel states that it could all be done easily, painlessly. He got absolutely no takers. And so it was that in the summer of 1862, he decided to radicalize his tactics and issue an Emancipation Proclamation as an act of military necessity to save the Union. But there were other ways to have saved the Union, like the Democrats' way of opening peace negotiations with the South. Lincoln refused. And now we come to one of those famous statements, one of these statements of Lincoln that are part of the moderate legend, a statement he made in an open letter to the newspaper editor Horace Greeley in August 1862 in response to an editorial in the New York Tribune criticizing him as being too lackluster on the issue of freeing slaves. Lincoln seized this opportunity to put himself on record in this famous statement. As I quote the words to you, quote them from memory. Many of you have heard them before. Of course you have. My paramount object in this struggle, he said, is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. If I could save the Union by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Well, there you are. He said it, Honest Abe. His paramount goal was to save the Union. That's what he said. To which I say, nonsense. It was a deception. It doesn't make sense, because if saving the Union had been his one and only goal, or at least paramount goal since the beginning, why did he kill the Crittenden Compromise back in December of 1860? Remember that? It was a last-ditch attempt to avert war through a package of constitutional amendments to save the Union at the expense of the slavery issue. If Lincoln had only been dedicated to supporting the Union, saving the Union, he should have embraced it wholeheartedly. He didn't. He shot it down. He killed it. Why? Because that was not his paramount goal. His paramount goal was to save the Union his way, with slavery contained and on course toward extinction. Lincoln made that statement to Horace Greeley to soften up public opinion because the midterm elections were approaching in November 1862. And if a white supremacist backlash against emancipation should give control of Congress to the Democrats, there was just no telling how quickly the cause that Lincoln believed in would unravel. It was a moderate seeming statement that belied Lincoln's secret intent. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves, but just the same, it was a radical, unprecedented act. And when Lincoln's armies made progress against the enemy in 1863, in every military campaign where it was possible, those armies began to free slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation went to work, and by the time of the 1864 presidential election, under the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation, about 3/4 of all the slaves had already been freed by Lincoln's armies. But there was a white supremacist backlash against the Emancipation Proclamation, a ferocious one. And in 1863, as the proclamation was carried out and put into effect, Lincoln knew that he was on borrowed time. Only one more year remained before the presidential election of 1864. Jefferson Davis didn't have to worry about that because the Confederate Constitution gave him a 6-year term. But Lincoln would have to face the voters again in 1864, and if a white supremacist Democrat threw him out of office, all those freed slaves might get sent right back into chains again. And so it was that in 1863, Lincoln began a remarkable behind-the-scenes effort. Very few people are aware of this, but it's documented to the hilt. There's just no doubt about it. He began working secretly behind the scenes to use military power, occupation forces in Confederate states to force the rewriting of the states' constitutions to change those slave states into free states. I think he got the idea from the newly created state of West Virginia, the breakaway western counties of Virginia. A new free state was added to the Union. Well, in the same month, June 1863, that Congress admitted West Virginia, Lincoln wrote to the general in charge of Union occupation forces in Louisiana, Nathaniel Banks, and he told him between the lines to see what could be done to get a movement started to revisit the Louisiana state constitution, have a convention, and rewrite it to change Louisiana from a slave state to a free state. And I'll quote to you briefly from a letter that he wrote to Nathaniel Banks. The Lincoln's sense of humor at work here. He's giving himself deniability. He's giving himself cover. Here's what Lincoln wrote to Nathaniel Banks, quote, "While I very well know what I would be glad for Louisiana to do, it's quite a different thing for me to assume direction of the matter. I would be glad for her to make a new constitution recognizing the Emancipation Proclamation and adopting emancipation in those parts of the state to which the proclamation does not apply. If these views can be of any advantage in giving shape, impetus, and action there, I shall be glad for you to use them prudently for that object." By the end of 1863, he wasn't writing tongue-in-cheek between the lines anymore. The process was moving too slowly, so he told Nathaniel Banks, "Hurry up, time is running out." And this brings us to the matter of another standard item in the myth of Lincoln the Moderate, his supposedly lenient plan for Reconstruction, the famous 10% plan, announced in a proclamation sent to Congress in December 1863. The way the legend goes, Lincoln the Moderate, the quintessential Lincoln, was quite willing to let the South up easy, offer a lenient easy, forgiving formula for Reconstruction. Get it over with quickly, easily. The 10% part boiled down to this. Lincoln said that he was willing to offer a presidential pardon to any rebel who would stop being a rebel, give up the rebellion, and take a loyalty oath to the Union. And as soon as 10% of those in that state, in any given rebel state who had voted in 1860 took that oath, he would allow that 10% to elect a state legislature and become the electorate of that state. Now, what could be easier or more lenient than that? Well, it certainly looks lenient, all right, except for this. In that loyalty oath that each one of those rebels had to swear in order to get pardoned, that rebel not only had to swear on the Holy Bible, and this is serious business in the Bible Belt, they had to swear, so help them God, that they would be loyal to the United States and the union of the states within that nation, but that they would support and abide by the Emancipation Proclamation and any other anti-slavery act passed by Congress. So help them God. And if they couldn't swear to that on the Bible, they wouldn't be able to vote. Now, do you see the trickiness of Lincoln at work? It meant, because of that particular oath that had to be sworn, that the only white ex-rebels who would be allowed to vote in those states would be ex-rebels who could sincerely, on the Bible, swear that they supported emancipation. That meant that the only people who could vote in those states would be anti-slavery whites. The pro-slavery whites would all be disfranchised. And it wouldn't take very many of those anti-slavery whites, now would it? Only 10%, to overpower the wishes of a 90% pro-slavery majority and change that slave state into a free state. Now, isn't that just one of the trickiest things you ever heard? An absolute masterpiece of cunning, a tour de force. Anyway, Lincoln faced the greatest challenge of his political career, if not his life, in the summer of 1864, when it looked like he was going to lose, because the Confederate strategy was a strategy of attrition. Dig in, inflict massive casualties, make the Northern public so sick of the war, so sick of the death, that they would turn Lincoln out of office and replace him with a white supremacist Democrat who would come to terms with the South. The Confederate strategy was to let the clock run out on Lincoln's presidency, and Lincoln knew it. What turned the tide was the total war genius, not only of Ulysses S. Grant, who by then was Lincoln's general-in-chief, but William Tecumseh Sherman, who captured Atlanta in September 1864, and the tide of public opinion turned overwhelmingly in Lincoln's direction. Lincoln was re-elected in a landslide. And as soon as he went to work, not just behind the scenes, but in public as well. All of you people who may remember that Steven Spielberg movie from 2012, Lincoln, about Lincoln's effort between December 1864 and January 1865 to get the 13th Amendment out of Congress. Yes, a constitutional amendment had been introduced in December 1863 to end slavery everywhere, at once, forever. It had passed the Senate, but it was stalled in the House of Representatives. And you remember the deal-making, the arm-twisting, the extraordinary lengths that Lincoln, the strategist, went to get that amendment out of Congress, and he did. Well, in 1865, that amendment would be sent out to the states for ratification. Now I'll give you another example of Lincoln's boldness and audacity that you probably hadn't heard of. In February 1865, Lincoln secretly proposed to his cabinet that he should send legislation to Congress offering to pay the slave states to ratify the 13th Amendment. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Can you imagine that? $400 million to pay them off, pay them to ratify the amendment. Breathtaking by my standards. Constitutional? Well, my goodness, nothing in the Constitution envisions such a thing, but nothing in the Constitution forbids it either. So Lincoln wanted to go ahead. Well, the cabinet didn't like the idea, so Lincoln just put it away. But if he had lived, he might have brought it out later. What Lincoln did accomplish in the spring of 1865 was to continue working in that laboratory state of Louisiana, which by then had been turned into a free state, to lay the groundwork for Black voting rights. I'm going to quote you one more excerpt from the last speech that Lincoln was ever destined to give. Just after Lee's army had surrendered, a crowd of well-wishers had gathered at the White House, an immense crowd. They wanted a speech from Lincoln. He gave them a speech on Reconstruction. And he began to go into great detail with respect to what was going on in Louisiana. And he talked about that 10% plan, you know, that plan for Reconstruction that had seemed so lenient. Bear with me, I'm going to read you a statement which, for Lincoln humor, by my standards, is almost unsurpassed. As a general rule, Lincoln said, I abstain from reading the reports of attacks upon myself, wishing not to be provoked by that to which I cannot properly offer an answer. In spite of this precaution, however, it comes to my knowledge that I am much censured for some supposed agency in setting up and seeking to sustain the new state government of Louisiana. In this I have done just so much as, and no more than, the public knows. In the annual message of December 63, I presented a plan of Reconstruction, as the phrase goes, which I promised, if adopted by any state, should be acceptable to and sustained by the executive government of the nation. I distinctly stated that this was not the only plan which might possibly be acceptable. When the message of 1863, with the plan before mentioned, reached New Orleans, General Banks wrote me that he was confident the people, with his military cooperation, would reconstruct substantially on that plan. I wrote him, and some of them, to try it. They tried it, and the result is known. Such only has been my agency in getting up the Louisiana government. I'm going to pause here and ask how Lincoln could have kept a straight face while making that statement. What he did behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the public, was immense, but he, no doubt, presumed that his letters to Nathaniel Banks would stay secret for many years, which of course they did. Now listen to this. He continues. As to sustaining it, that is, as to sustaining that 10% government in Louisiana, as to sustaining it, my promise is out, as before stated. But as bad promises are better broken than kept, I shall treat this as a bad promise and break it whenever I shall be convinced that keeping it is adverse to the public interest. But I have not yet been so convinced. Who but Lincoln would have the audacity to say such a thing? He went on advocating on behalf of the Louisiana experiment. And one of the reasons he wanted it to continue was because it laid the groundwork for Black voting rights. The new Constitution, making Louisiana a free state, gave the state legislature the power to enfranchise African-American men. The elective franchise is the term of art that Lincoln uses. And then he drops the bombshell. He himself would like to see it done. And then he begins to get passionate, charismatic. 12,000 people, he said, in the state of Louisiana had become legitimate voters under the terms of that 10% plan. They'd approved this Constitution, making Louisiana a free state. The Constitution made provision for public schools to be open to both Black and white, and it gave the legislature the power to confer the vote upon African Americans. And then Lincoln said this: if we sustain the new government of Louisiana, we encourage the hearts and nerve the arms of the 12,000 to adhere to their work and argue for it and proselyte for it and fight for it and feed it and grow it and ripen it to a complete success. The colored man, too, in seeing all united for him, is inspired with vigilance and energy and daring to the same end, unquote. Now, this is Lincoln, the supposed racist, telling African Americans he wants them to show energy and vigilance and daring in their quest for the vote, and he would help them. On the White House lawn was John Wilkes Booth and two of his co-conspirators. When Lincoln had finished, Booth turned to one of them and urged him to shoot Lincoln on the spot. And when that co-conspirator demurred, Booth said, "Then I will. This is going to be the last speech he ever makes." How do we know Booth said this? Well, after Lincoln's murder, Booth and the other conspirators were pursued and hunted down. Booth was killed before he could be tried and convicted. But the other conspirators were apprehended, tried, and convicted. And in the course of the legal proceedings, they had attorneys. Well, they talked to these attorneys. Later on, several of these attorneys wrote memoirs. And in several of these memoirs by the attorneys representing the defendants are cross-corroborations of the story about what John Wilkes Booth said after Lincoln had concluded that speech. Lincoln, I think, might have had the power in a full second four-year term, with Republicans controlling both houses of Congress by supermajorities, to at least attempt to give the United States its civil rights revolution 100 years before the civil rights revolution of the 1960s. And with Lincoln managing things, with Lincoln, the strategist at work, who can say that is the stolen future that John Wilkes Booth took from the American people on April 14th, 1865. That concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to take questions from the audience.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. We have a couple questions here. We'll just jump right into them. Laura asks, we always hear about some other things about Lincoln. One thing we don't hear about Abraham Lincoln is his foreign policy approach. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, well, there are several dimensions to that. One of them is quite poignant in light of today's Republican Party politics. There were great controversies from the 1840s into the 1850s regarding immigration. There was a lot of opposition to different ethnic minorities being admitted to the United States and then being allowed to become citizens. Lincoln was absolutely in favor of open opportunity for open immigration for people to come here and become citizens. That's one part of it. Another part of it is that during the Civil War, part of Lincoln's overall strategy to defeat the Confederacy was inherently diplomatic and international, because like the leaders of the American Revolution in the 1770s, the leaders of the Confederacy knew that they would need foreign assistance in order to prevail, just as the colonial rebels confronted what was then the great superpower of Europe in the 1770s, Great Britain. The Confederates were absolutely outclassed by the free states when it came to industrial productivity, agricultural productivity, manpower, and they knew it. And so they decided immediately in the spring of 1861 that they would do what the American revolutionaries had done in the 1770s, reach, across the ocean to get foreign recognition and foreign assistance, as the American revolutionaries succeeded in doing in 1778 with the Anglo-French alliance. And the Confederates tried to draw both the French and the British into the war. First recognizing the Confederacy and then intervening to assist the Confederacy, and they came perilously close to achieving. In 1862, in particular, Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, was quite pro-Confederate in his sentiments. Many people within the British aristocracy harbored pro-Confederate sentiments. Queen Victoria was ardently anti-slavery, and that put a bit of a check, upon the policies of Prime Minister Palmerston. But it was an extremely dangerous situation. Lincoln sent various emissaries, most pointedly Charles Francis Adams, to London as American minister to work tirelessly to prevent British recognition of the Confederacy, but it was a very, very close call. Some of the early military defeats before Lincoln had, for the Union, before Lincoln had found his high command dream team, made the Confederacy look awfully good, you know, in terms of the likelihood of winning in the summer of 1862. And in the fall of 1862, the Confederates launched an all-out counteroffensive in all theaters of the war. The most famous one was the thrust into Maryland that got stopped at the Battle of Antietam. But there were two others to the west. They were giving it everything they had to finally tip that balance and achieve British recognition. And it's another thing they were trying to do on the domestic scene was to prompt a white supremacist backlash that would give the Democrats control of Congress. They were seeking all the external help they could get, and they came very, very close to achieving it in 1862. And it's a commentary on Lincoln's risk-taking boldness that he issued the Emancipation Proclamation before Lee's invasion had been stopped at the Battle of Antietam. But it was stopped, and that danger of foreign recognition began to subside by 1863.
Okay, great. We have another question. You kind of touched upon this at the very end. William asks, how do you think our nation's history would be changed if Lincoln wasn't assassinated? Would we have been successful in reuniting the country?
Well, of course, we'll never know. I mean, one can never write what they call counterfactual history. One can never write a history of events that never unfolded. We can only speculate and admit that we are speculating. And I've done that already. I just have the feeling, I mean, who knows? Nothing is guaranteed. Lincoln might finally have begun to reach the outermost limits of his strategic brilliance. It might not have worked, but all the signs show that in the springtime of 1865, he was working with the radical Republicans to adopt a party-wide consensus on black voting rights, on land redistribution in the South, lots of things like that that really could have possibly given the United States not only reunification, but moral consistency in race relations, a real lasting civil rights revolution. With Lincoln gone, with that leadership gone, the radical Republicans tried to do what they could in radical Reconstruction, and they did make some short-term gains, but it was short-lived. You know, the advances got rolled back, and by the end of the 19th century, the system of, you know, Jim Crow, white supremacy was hammered into place. If Lincoln had lived, might not have happened. There's something else about Lincoln. He was a real advocate of big government in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton. Big government spending, public works, internal improvements. As an example, I give you the commencement of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad right in the middle of the Civil War. Internal improvements is what Republicans called them. Remember, Lincoln was proposing to pay $400 million to the slave states to ratify the 13th Amendment. Part of his intent was to inject a massive amount of purchasing power into the southern states that might lay the groundwork for a new surge of prosperity with opportunities for all. The mind reels. I mean, this man was capable of so much and intended clearly to do such daring things, and it was not to be.
Okay. We have another question. Eileen asks, what's your opinion on Mary Lincoln's role in Lincoln's audacity? You mentioned audacity a lot in the book, so she's curious about that.
Well, my book, Summoned to Glory, is a biography, and I have a lot to say about Mary Todd Lincoln. I have a lot to say about Lincoln's love life and family life. Mary Lincoln is a very controversial figure. She has her detractors, she has her defenders. Previous Lincoln biographer, I'm not going to mention names, went so far in criticizing Mary Lincoln, calling her a shrew, a terrible wife, that a tremendous backlash against him erupted. Mary Both of the Lincolns had very serious emotional issues. Lincoln struggled since his early adulthood with recurrent depression. Mary Lincoln succumbed to, from time to time, to, well, abusive hysteria. Um, she, the question as to why Lincoln married her, why Lincoln stayed married to her. These questions go very deep and they connect to a lot of other questions. One of the great legends about Lincoln and his love life, a legend that new research has shown was no legend at all. It was absolutely true. For years, there were rumors that in his 20s, he fell ardently in love with a beautiful, lovely, adoring woman in New Salem, Illinois, named Anne Rutledge. And she died in 1835, left him heartbroken, nearly drove him insane. Um, Lincoln's final law partner, William Herndon, gave a speech in 1866 in which he claimed that after losing Anne Rutledge, Lincoln was simply incapable of fully loving any other woman for the rest of his life. And that seemed to be such an extravagant claim that the whole matter achieved the status of a myth, a disreputable legend. In the 1990s, new research turned up an amazing amount of evidence showing beyond any reasonable doubt that the Lincoln and Rutledge love affair was absolutely real, and that it did propel him into clinical depression. Some theorize that Lincoln settled for a less than stellar marriage because emotionally he was afraid to fall deeply in love again. If he found another woman as wonderful as Anne and lost her, perhaps, he would lose his sanity once and for all. He didn't want to take that chance. Who knows? Emotional issues like that lay buried far below the surface. It seems, possible. But William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, did say, he did assert that Lincoln's home life with Mary was so difficult because of her rages that he would get out, into his law practice and immerse himself in his career as much as possible. And some Lincoln scholars and biographers theorize that if Lincoln had had a more satisfactory home life, the driving ambition, that propelled him to his destiny might not have gathered, sufficient momentum to take him there. He might have settled down, as a happy husband, father, practicing attorney in Springfield, Illinois, and that would have been that. Who can say? But it's an apt question, the Lincoln marriage. And if any of you are curious, I go into great detail about, the give and take between Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln, both before the White House years and during.
Okay. What was Lincoln's views on the Copperheads and free speech? Because he of course suspended habeas corpus.
Yes, he did. Lincoln was not very hesitant to use his executive powers to crack down on well, let me put this as carefully as I can. It was not a matter of free speech. Lincoln had his critics in Congress, in the cabinet, inside government, outside government. He was vilified, called names, and the rip-roaring gusto of American democracy at work, went on unimpaired by any attempts to silence or stifle anything. But when it came to active interference in the war effort, encouraging soldiers to desert, encouraging young men to evade the draft, things like that, then for Lincoln it became a matter of treason, sedition. I mean, according to Lincoln, the whole Confederate movement was treason. Um, it was not a war between sovereign states. There was no Confederacy, Lincoln proclaimed, because secession was completely impossible. It was hallucinatory, and any attempt to make it happen was treason. Well, the Constitution does provide for the high crime of treason, punishment for treason, punishment for sedition, and Lincoln tried to walk a fine line between taking measures he deemed necessary to prevent sabotage of the war effort and um, interfering as little as possible in the normal processes of American democracy. You know, some people at the time were wondering if he would try to seek postponement of the presidential election in 1864. Oh, what a temptation that must have been, given the way the politics looked for him in the summer of that year. Absolutely not. He wouldn't have dreamed of proposing any such thing. To the contrary, he said it was a demonstration of confidence in the Constitution, in the nation, that the election would go forward regardless of anything else. So opinions will differ, you know, on Lincoln and civil liberties, Lincoln and big government, all that whole span of issues. But to me, Lincoln handled things justifiably and exceptionally well.
Okay, great. Well, we have one more question, if anybody would like to ask that for our author. So you can put it in the Q&A or in the chat section. I guess I'll just mention in the meantime, in case anybody's burning for a question, don't forget, there's the link up there. You can get it from The Learned Owl, and you can purchase a copy of his book. See if anybody has any questions. If not, I probably would like to ask one. Guess I'll go ahead and ask it. In the meantime, what were Lincoln's views on the Constitution and the Founding Fathers? You know, they didn't come right out and say anything about slavery, but what was his interpretation of that? You know, did they do things wrong? Was it time to sort of move away and reframe the Constitution?
Well, Lincoln said quite a lot about it. Lincoln's constitutionalism was extremely interesting. One of the things he did say about the Constitution as early as 1854, he pointed out that the words slave or slavery are not mentioned as such in the document. Euphemisms are used, persons held to service, that sort of thing. And in Lincoln's view, this was because enough of the founding fathers, not all, but enough of them, knew that slavery was wrong. To avoid it, avoid any mention of it, avoid any direct condoning of it, in the hope that over time, ways and means could be found to phase it out. And there was a great deal of historical truth in that. Some of the founding fathers were ardently pro-slavery, especially some of the congressmen from South Carolina. At the Constitutional Convention, delegates from South Carolina drove very, very hard bargains in hammering out the Constitution to protect slavery as much as possible for as long as possible, and they said so. But others, Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, were out and out abolitionists. And the slaveholding founders from the Upper South, particularly George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, freely acknowledged that slavery was wrong. And they wanted to put it on course for ultimate extinction. Lincoln reminded Americans of this, or informed them of it if they didn't know, over and over again in the 1850s. And over again, he pointed to the Declaration of Independence, as he did in that long speech I quoted to you from Chicago, as the real founding document. And this was a bold thing to do in and of itself. I mean, the Constitution has over time become sanctified and enshrined, you know, as the nation's founding document. Lincoln was holding aloft the Declaration of Independence as the nation's real founding document. After all, the federal Constitution was the second Constitution under which the United States had functioned, the first one being the Articles of Confederation. The federal Constitution could be amended, had been amended, would go on to be amended. The federal Constitution could be twisted and construed by packed Supreme Courts, like it was in the Dred Scott decision of 1857. The Constitution could be twisted and maneuvered, but the Declaration of Independence and the Equality Credo of Jefferson would stand for all time, Lincoln said, as the true guiding, founding purpose of the nation. And it's really interesting in that letter to Albert Hodges that I quoted earlier when he said, I claim not to have controlled events and so on. Among the criticisms of these Kentucky conservatives when they came to call on Lincoln at the White House were claims that he had been acting unconstitutionally. And he said a most remarkable thing. He said, what I am trying to do is to save the nation of which the Constitution is the organic law. He used a metaphor. He said, it is widely acknowledged that sometimes we have to sacrifice a limb to save a life. But is it ever wise to sacrifice a life to save a limb? If the nation goes down, he said, who will really care very much about whether every single jot and tittle of the Constitution has been observed? In these circumstances, he said, things otherwise unconstitutional may become lawful to save the nation in order to save the Constitution. Now, this is reasoning that stretches legal theory, perhaps to the breaking point. But it's an illustration, whether you like it or not, of the way Lincoln saw the Constitution. The Constitution was derivative, not primary. The Constitution was very, very important, but it was mutable. It could be amended, it could be construed and interpreted this way and that. But what stood rock solid was the purpose of the nation as proclaimed in the Declaration. So Lincoln relegated the Constitution to secondary status, really, compared to the Declaration of Independence. And he was prepared to play fast and loose as a constitutionalist, like in that idea to pay the slave states off, to ratify a constitutional amendment. How on earth could that be constitutional? Well, nothing forbids it, and so forth.
Okay.
Audacious, as I say.
One final question tonight. Edward asks, how was Lincoln's vision shelved when he died?
I beg your pardon?
Oh, how was Lincoln's vision shelved when he died?
Shelved?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't entirely. Lincoln became a great martyr, a sainted figure for those who loved him, and millions of Americans did. Second father of his country, second, George Washington. But the goals that he sought in terms of race equality, the American dream expanded to its utmost scope for as many people as possible. The radical Republicans, the many thousands of advocates of race equality and civil rights did try to carry out those ideals during Reconstruction. And so-called Lincoln Republicans down the years, and the Republican parties would continue to do that. And the Lincoln legacy in the Republican Party, as well as in the United States generally, became overwhelming. Theodore Roosevelt raised, as a Lincoln Republican. Theodore Roosevelt's father went to Washington to assist the war effort. He met Abraham and Mary Lincoln. He came back to New York and told, the family all about it. Young Teddy Roosevelt possibly watched Lincoln's funeral procession moving through New York. And when Roosevelt became president, he made it clear again and again he wanted to revive Lincoln-esque, principles within the Republican Party. His young niece Eleanor, who would marry a young cousin Franklin, raised as a Lincoln Republican. The building of the Lincoln Memorial dedicated in 1922. Iconic American shrine. Lincoln's legacy, Lincoln's reputation hardly shelved after his death, but it was gradually stripped of the ardent, daring, risk-taking boldness in seeking to expand, opportunity for all, most definitely African Americans. And when the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated, the lovely verse inscription behind the statue of Lincoln enthroned goes like this: "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." Lincoln, the savior of the Union, nothing about slavery. So if you want to entertain the idea that Lincoln's legacy was shelved, I would have to say only in part, a very important part, but only in part.
Well, just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Striner, for coming and speaking to us again. This was a wonderful talk. Everybody enjoyed it. Just in case you forgot, the email of Mr. Striner was over there. So in case anybody has any questions they want to ask the author, he'll feel free to answer us again. So thank you again, Mr.
Well, I hope you will reach out to me. I'm sorry I couldn't answer more questions. I would be delighted to communicate with you. The email is rstriner2@washcoll.edu. I've retired from Washington College, but they let me use the email. So that's the best way to reach me.
Okay, that's always a good thing too. Alrighty, well, thank you again, and thanks for everybody for coming out. Hopefully we'll see everybody again for another Zoom program. So good night and take care.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.